It is again time to apply what we learned. In the last course sections, we did learn about sending HTTP requests, and we did learn about forms and handling user input. In this course section, we'll continue working on this food order application, on this food delivery application, on which we started working a couple of sections ago already. And we are going to add a form and we are going to add HTTP requests, because this course section is about applying what we learned to this food order app. And therefore, we are going to add a basic checkout form where we can enter our name and address once we click on the order button. We also then want to submit that entered data to a backend, so to a server with a HTTP request. We probably also want to validate the user input on the client before we submit it. And we also want to fetch some data from a server, from a backend. We want to fetch the meals data. So the data here for these dummy meals which we got, which is currently hard-coded into the JavaScript files, that data should move to a backend as well and should be fetched from there. Now, when I say backend, I still mean Firebase, of course. We used this as a dummy backend before, and we can still use it here. Here I will use my existing project which I got, and I'll use the real-time database there. If you create a new project, make sure that you also do start with the real-time database. And of course, make sure that you did go through the HTTP section and so on. There, I'll clear any existing data which I have. And you want to make sure that under rules, you have read and write set to true so that you can send requests to that database successfully. Now, how to work with the database, that is something I did show before in the HTTP section. Now, in this module, we are going to implement these features here step by step together, but this also is a great chance for you to practice what you learned. So definitely try that on your own first. Try implementing all those features on your own first. Move that dummy data to Firebase manually. You can add data manually here to Firebase. So move that dummy data to Firebase. And once the data is there, implement these three main features to this food delivery app on your own. Try it on your own first, and thereafter, from the next lecture on, you can check my approach to compare it to yours, to solve problems if you got stuck in between, and to then simply build this together with me. So, were you successful? If you didn't try it on your own, definitely consider trying it on your own. Practicing what you learned is an important aspect of learning React. Either way, we're now going to implement these features together. And I will actually start with fetching the meals data, even though that's the bottommost point here. But I will start with that because I think it makes sense that we are able to load that data from a server, from a backend. For this, in the Firebase real-time database console, I'll add a new node manually, and I will name it meals. And then click this plus again here to add some nested data. And then I just want to add my meals data to Firebase here. Now for this, I'll start by giving every meal an ID here. So I'll just use M1 as a key. And then the value for that will be the nested data for that meal. With that, I'm kind of replicating that Firebase data structure we saw in the HTTP section for the dummy data I got here. So for the meal with the ID M1, I want to have a name field and a value of sushi, a description field with this value, and a price field with this value. So let's start with the name field here and enter sushi as a value and click add. And now this entry was added. Now we can add more nested data to this M1 meal by clicking this plus and adding the description field, where I then enter a description like this and click add, and add a price field, which is this value, which has this value. So let's enter that. Okay, so with that, we got the first meal. Now let's click on the plus here next to meals, and let's add a new meal with a different ID, M2, and then click on this plus here to add the nested data like the name, and that will then be schnitzel here in my case. Click add, and then then add the description here, which is this text here, like this, and let's add the price field with a value of 16.5. So now we got the second meal added. And I'll continue doing that. You can, of course, fast forward here if I'm boring you. I will now add the third meal with a name of barbecue burger, like that. Click add, and then also add the description here, American, raw, and meaty. And also add a price for that third meal here. So let's add a price field like this. And now there's only one more meal to go, the green bowl. For that, I'll add a new meal with an ID of M4. Click the plus, and for the name field, it's now green bowl. For the description field, I will now add this description here, like this. And then last but not least, for the price field, it's $18.99. And with that, all the data is on this Firebase server. And of course, if we were the owner of this food delivery service, we could be administrating the data here. Now let's work on this front end and let's fetch that data from that server. So here in available meals, I now no longer want to use the dummy meals array. So I now want to get rid here of dummy meals and instead fetch data from Firebase. And we learned how that works. For this, we can use the built-in fetch API, which is built into the browser. So this fetch function exists out of the box. We could also use a custom HTTP hook, for example, the one which we built in the HTTP section, but here I will build it from scratch again. Though if you want to use a custom hook or want to build a custom hook or use some third-party HTTP hook package, that would of course also be okay. But I want to build it from scratch here, so I'll write the fetch function from scratch, and I want to fetch my meals data when this component is loaded. And we learned that we can utilize the useEffect hook for this. So we can import useEffect from React to trigger a side effect like fetching data from the web when some data changes, or for example, when that component is loaded for the first time. So here I'll set up useEffect and the effect function that should be triggered. And then in there we can call fetch like this. Now here we want to send an HTTP request to this meals node here. So to this Firebase URL and then this meals node. So the full URL is this Firebase URL, which I grabbed here, and then meals.json. .json is something Firebase specific, which we have to add. So with that, we're sending a request to this REST API endpoint, which Firebase exposes here, and we're sending this request to fetch the meals. We could configure this request, as you learned, with a second argument passed to fetch, but there we could, for example, change the HTTP method and so on, and we don't really want to do that here. We want to stick to the default GET request, so this is fine. Now, fetch returns a promise, since sending such a HTTP request is an asynchronous task. Hence, we can add then here to provide a function, this function here, which is triggered when the request is done, once we got a response. Or we use async await. For this, we need to turn this into an async function so that we can use the await keyword here. But here we have to be careful. And actually, we even get a warning here. At least you might get one depending on your project setup. The function you pass to useEffect should not return a promise. Instead, you learned that the function you pass to useEffect may return a cleanup function which can be executed. You learned about that in the module where I introduced useEffect. That cleanup function should run synchronously though. It should not return a promise or anything like this. Hence, this overall function which we pass to useEffect must not be turned into an async function. Instead, if you want to use async await instead of useEffect, simply create a new function in here, fetch meals, like this, and use async here and put your code, this line of code, into this nested inner function. And then just execute fetch meals as part of useEffect. By doing it that way, this function is still executed and you can still use async await, but the overall useEffect function does now not return a promise. It's now not an async function because we have not added async here, which would not be allowed. So that's a little workaround around that restriction, which is absolutely fine though. So now with that, we can use async await to get a response here for fetching our meals. And then you learned that for fetch, we can parse data. We get our response data by calling response.json, which also returns a promise. Hence, we also have the await keyword here. So that's how we can get the response data which we're fetching, and then we can utilize that response data. Now, the response data we're getting in the case of Firebase, and that's something Firebase specific, will always be an object where these IDs here, M1, M2, M3, M4, will be keys, and then the values for those keys will be nested objects with those properties. Hence, what we get back here, response data, will be an object, and I want an array. Therefore, we need to transform this. So we can create a new constant loaded meals, which is an empty array, and then we use a for in loop to go through all the keys in response data. So in this response data object. And the keys will be these IDs here. And the values for those keys will then be the nested objects, as I just explained. So here we then want to reach out to loaded meals and push a new object into this initially empty array, where we, for example, set the ID property. We need to set ID here because we do expect our meals to have an ID field. So we should make sure that we transform the loaded data such that we do have an ID field. And then we can set ID equal to key because, as I just mentioned, the key will be the ID of the individual meals we're fetching. Now, we also need to set a name, the description and price fields, and name can be pulled out of the response data for the given key. With that, we access the nested object in there, and then that nested object will have a name field, as I just showed you. We're now accessing this nested name field here, for example. And we don't just do that for the name, we also replicate this for the description here. And then also one more time for the price. Like that. And with that, we're transforming the fetched data. Now we need to expose that fetched data to the rest of our component, and we want to re-render the component once the fetching is done, because that's an asynchronous task which is only started after the component loaded for the first time, and therefore initially there will be no data, and we want to update the component once the data is there. Now, when we have data that changes and where a component should be re-evaluated once it did change, whenever we have a use case like this, we need state. So we should also import use state here from React, and then set up some state in this component by calling use state. And here we initially might have an empty array because this state will be our meals and the set meals state updating function. It's now the meals which I want to use down there instead of dummy meals to render the meal items. And initially that's an empty array again, but that will change once the loaded data is there. And therefore here after this for loop, once we filled our loaded meals helper constant here with the transformed data, I want to call set meals. So I want to call that state updating function and pass in the loaded meals. So that array which we populated here. With that, we're setting the data, and therefore then this component should update. Now for this useEffect function here, currently our dependency array is an empty array. So we have no dependencies, which means this useEffect function, this function here, will only run when the component was first loaded. It will never run again thereafter. And that sounds about right to me. We indeed have no dependencies in there. We're not using any external component-specific data. We're not using any props in there or anything like that. And therefore, only running this when the component is first loaded makes a lot of sense. So we don't need to change this dependencies array. And therefore, with all of that, if we save this, we go back to our project. If I reload, you see initially that list is empty, but then the data arrives quickly. Now, of course, we can show some loading spinner or some loading state instead if we want to, though currently the experience also isn't too bad, I would argue. But still, handling a loading state and a potential error state is something we're going to dive in next. So we are fetching our data, but as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, we are of course not showing any loading or error state at the moment. And that's not necessarily the behavior we want. Instead, we might want to only load this list of meals here once we really got a list of meals. And to achieve this, we need to manage more state. And now, since we will have related state, we could also consider using useReducer for that. But I'll stick to 3 individual use state pieces. I will add a isLoading state and a setIsLoading state updating function. And initially it's false. Initially we're not loading. But in useEffect, at the beginning of this fetchMeals function, I want to call setIsLoading and set this to true, because now we clearly are loading. Of course, since we know that right when this component will be rendered, we will be loading, we could also consider not setting isLoading to true here, but instead setting the initial state to true. Because we know that we always will start with loading data in this component when the component is rendered. And therefore, in this case, that's fine. Of course, if you have a component where that's not necessarily the case, where you're not necessarily loading just because the component was created for the first time, there you might not want to set this. But here it should be fine. Now we want to set isLoading to false once we're done. So in the end, once we also set the meals, we want to set isLoading to false, because we now definitely are done loading. And now we can use setIsLoading to control what we render. And we could say that we don't want to render our meals at all. So this entire section should not be rendered at all if we're loading. So for that, we can simply check if isLoading is true. And I check this before I try to map my meals. Before I do any of that, I check if isLoading is true. And if it is true, I will return something else in this functional component. So then we don't even make it to the code down there. And I'll return a section here where I simply have a paragraph where I say loading. Like this. If we add that code, you will see there is this loading text on the left, briefly showing up when we reload this. And that's, of course, not the best way to show it. And therefore, let's style it by adding a class name here of classes meals loading, written like this maybe. And then we can dive into this available meals module CSS file and add this quickly. Add a class selector for the meals loading class, where we set text align to center and set the color to white. Of course, you can definitely give this a more elaborate styling, but it's better than nothing. Because with this class added here and assigned here to this section, with those changes made, if I reload, we at least have the loading text here. And it's still only flashing for a brief moment because Firebase is a quick backend, but it's better than nothing. Of course, here we could consider omitting this loading state since the data is loading rather quickly, but of course we don't know which internet connection our end users might have, so showing this loading state might not be too bad. Actually, there it was showing up a bit longer. So that is not too bad. But what if we have an error? We should also work on that. Let's simulate an error. And for that, we can, for example, remove .json, something Firebase doesn't like. And if we do it and I reload, we therefore fail to load the data. We don't see anything here in our app, but we see it if I open the developer tools. There we see that we have an error. We failed to fetch the data. And of course, our typical users will not check that console. Therefore, we want to show the error also here on this screen. And it's up to you how you want to show it. I at least want to show an error message down here instead of loading. Hence, we need a third state. We need a state that determines whether we have an error or not. So an HTTP error, for example, but the state name is up to you. So here we have that. And initially, the value here is false or maybe null or simply undefined. Because it's not just a true false value, later instead I want to have the error message here, and initially I don't want to have any value. So an undefined value, so not passing any default value like this should be fine. We could also set it to null to be more explicit about our goal of not having any value initially. But I'll go with undefined. Now, when we fetch data and we fail, I want to, set my error. For this, we first of all need to find out if we failed. Now, for this, I want to check if response OK is falsy. So if it's not OK, hence the exclamation mark. And we'll make it into this if check if we have some error status code reported back by the server. And if that should be the case, I want to throw a new error here where I say something went wrong. Now, we could also look into the error response and see if the server gave us a more useful error string, but here I'll just stick to this generic error message. And I'm throwing it as a new error, which means that the lines thereafter won't execute. Instead, now we want to handle this error, and that's another advantage of using a separate function for wrapping this fetch logic. This fetch meals function will now throw an error if something goes wrong with sending that request. Therefore, we can go to the place where we call fetch meals, which is still inside of useEffect, but outside of the fetch meals function, of course. And we can simply wrap this with try catch. So we can try and catch here. So we try calling fetch meals, but if inside of that function an error is thrown, as is the case here, then we make it into this catch block, which is still inside of the effect function, but outside of the fetch meals function. And then here we can do whatever we want to do. I want to set is loading to false because we're not loading anymore. Even if it's an error, we're done loading. And I want to set HTTP error to the error we caught. So we do get access to that error here when using try catch, and therefore I can set the HTTP error to the error we're getting, or to be precise, to the error message. We'll get an error object here, and that object by default has a message property. When we generate an error like this, and we pass a string to the constructor, that string will be stored in the message property of the created error object. And with that, we should be setting this error state. Now we can also utilize that, and we can check, maybe after we checked for whether we're loading, we can check if HTTP error is truthy. So if it has a string with some text inside of it, for example. And in that case, return yet another state. In that case, I want to return a section with a text of HTTP error. So where I output my error text. And I'll give this a class of meals error, which we have yet to add. And we can quickly add this together. Meals error. Here, I'll also set this to text align center, but set the color to red. And that will not be too beautiful. I just want to have this little bit more errorish style. You can, of course, fine-tune the styling exactly as you want it. So now with that, if we save this and I reload here, we'll notice something interesting. It still only says loading here. Now, that can be tricky to spot. The reason for that is that we're using try-catch, but keep in mind that fetch meals is an async function. And therefore, it always returns a promise. Now, if we throw an error inside of a promise, that error will cause that promise to reject. So we can't use try-catch to wrap it unless we also await this, for which we would need to turn our effect function here into an async function, which we're not allowed to do. Now, we could still work around that by putting that into a separate function, which we call thereafter, so that we have two separate functions, one for sending the HTTP request and one for error handling, and that would be absolutely fine. But here I think it's a bit easier to simply use the fact that it's a promise and add the catch method on it. Since that returns a promise, we can add then to handle success cases when the promise fulfills successfully, and we can add catch to handle errors coming up inside of the promise. And therefore, instead of try catch here, we want to catch the error we're getting and move that code here into this catch block. And that's the traditional promise-only way of handling an error inside of a promise. And I hope I could make it clear why we need this here. With that, if we save this, if I reload, we see loading briefly and then failed to fetch. And again, of course, we can definitely improve the error handling here. We can show a more useful error message, but here my focus is to show you how it generally works. Because what you now render on the screen, that's of course not related to HTTP requests or anything like that. Here you can now build any user interface you want. But that therefore is how we could also handle errors. And with that, I'll re-add .json here to get rid of that error. And once we do that and we reload, we of course do load the data successfully again. And therefore, with that, we now implemented this third feature here, fetching meals data. Now let's work on a checkout and order form so that we can fetch some user data, which we then, as a last step, also submit to the server as an order. So now we added a couple of items to our cart. It would now be nice if we could order them. For this we have the order button, but currently that's not doing anything. I want to make sure that when we click this order button, we kind of expand this modal, and we also show a form where the user should enter the address and the name, and thereafter we can confirm that input to send off that order to the backend. And therefore the first step is to add that form and to add validation to that form. For this, let's go back to the code, and there, into the cart folder where we have this cart component which renders this modal with our cart data, with the total, and with those buttons. And here, below the total, above those buttons, I now want to render the form where we enter our data. And for that, I'll add a new component, and I'll name it checkout.js because it will be the checkout form. And we'll also need a checkout.module.css file for the styling, though I'll provide the styling to you once we're done setting up that form. So here in the checkout component, we now want to create a new functional component. So we create our component as we always did. We can import React. Depends on your project setup if you need that or not. I don't need it here, so I'll omit it. And I will already import classes from /checkout.module.css. Now in here, we want to return a form. We want to return a form with the various inputs for the different values we want to fetch. For this, I'll wrap every input into a div with a class name of classes.control. And in there, we can have a label, let's say for the name of the user. So that will be for an input with an ID of name. And then we have that input thereafter of type text with an ID of name. Should be matching that value here for accessibility. And we also add another input where we fetch the address of the user. So we want to have the street, and that should also be of type text. However, I'll give it an ID of street. And I add a new input where I also want to get the postal code. So that will get an ID of postal and will also still be of type text. Technically, the postal code looks like a number, but it should be text so that we can also start with 0 without kind of treating this as a null value, which I don't want. So that will also be text. And then last but not least, let's also grab the city, which is also text. So a bunch of text data which we're fetching here. The name, the street, the postal code, and the city. And then we also need a button to confirm this. So I'll say confirm on that button. Now that we built this basic unstyled checkout component, we can go back to the cart. And here I will then import checkout from ./checkout, so that new checkout component, and render that here below the total amount. And for the moment, I will always render it. We'll later make sure that it only shows up once we click on order. If I now save this, we have that form here with the confirm button. Now, of course, there are a couple of styling issues which we'll fix in a second, but before we fix those issues, let's make sure that this form only shows up when we click order, and that when it shows up, we actually get rid of these two buttons down there, and instead we only show the confirm button, and maybe also a cancel button here, and that we then also have basic functions that get triggered when we click those buttons. So let's make sure that this form only shows up once we did click on order. Now for this in the cart component, we have this order button, and currently it's not doing anything. So of course here we can add an onClick listener, the onClick prop, to trigger some function when that is clicked. So here I'll add a new function, order handler. And whenever this is clicked, I want to make sure that we show the checkout form. So we wire up the order button to the order handler function we just added. And then to show this checkout component conditionally, we need to use state. So let's import use state from React and then set up some state for this cart component. And here we could name the state is checking out or something like this. This sounds a bit weird. Let's maybe name it is checkout like this, and set is checkout. And initially that's false because initially we're not in checkout mode. But I want to set it to true if we clicked on the order handler. So here I'll set is checkout to true then. And now we can use the is checkout state to conditionally render the checkout component. So we can check if is checkout is truthy and use this syntax, which you saw a lot in the course, to render checkout if is checkout is truthy. And with that, if we save this, initially there's nothing here. But if I click on order, we show that. Now we might be running into some space issues here if that gets longer and longer, but we'll work on the styling in a second. Before we work on the styling, let's hide these two buttons when we clicked on order, and let's also add a second button to the form therefore, which still allows us to cancel. Now to hide these two buttons, we of course just again need to render them conditionally, and I could therefore just add code where I check if is not checkout, and only if that's the case we render that div. But to keep the JSX code down there a bit more structured, I'll grab that div with those buttons and add a new constant here with my modal actions and store my div in there in the modal actions. And then it's the modal actions which I want to render conditionally if not is checkout, so that the JSX down there stays lean and we have that div with the actions up there. Okay, so now with that, these buttons are gone. Now let's add a new button to that form. So for this, in the checkout component, I'll add a second button where I say cancel, and important, this button will be of type button so that it doesn't submit the form. Only this button will submit the form. And speaking of that, I want to handle both button clicks. If we click the cancel button, I want to close the modal, and that therefore means that I in the end want to do the same thing as I did in the cart component when this close button was clicked. There we triggered props on close, so in the end I want to trigger that same function now from inside the checkout component. Hence for the cancel button on click, I expect to get some function through props which I can forward this event to, and I will simply expect the on cancel prop here. It's our component, so we can expect whichever prop we want. And I will expect the on cancel prop, which means that now when we use checkout in the cart component, we need to set a on cancel prop, and as a value I want to point at the on close prop value to forward that event even further. And now of course we have some props drilling here, so we're passing props through multiple levels of components, and hence we could consider using context instead for managing the modal visibility, but I will stick to passing down props here because I don't want to make that too complex here and kind of go into a totally different area and add another context. So I will simply pass down my props here. Now with that, if I save this, if I click cancel, this modal is again closed. Okay, so that works. Now when we click confirm, the form will be submitted. And here we then want to validate the user input and show errors, show some feedback if something is invalid. And of course, if it is valid, we want to submit it to the backend, to Firebase. So for the moment, therefore, I want to focus on doing something, on triggering some function. And hence in checkout.js, we can add a new function here, confirm handler, where we get an event object. And we will get that automatically because I bind this function to the onSubmit event on the form. And then you learned that we should call event prevent default to ensure that the browser default, which would be to send an HTTP request, is prevented, so that this request is not sent. And with that, this button will trigger this form submission and will therefore trigger this function. Now we need to validate the user input, and for that we need to read what the user entered, and we then want to show some feedback, and of course potentially, if everything is all right, send the card data to the backend. But step by step, in the next lecture, we'll work on validating this and on showing some feedback. Now before we add any logic, let's add some styling. For this attached you find three files. You find the checkout module.css file, which you should use to replace yours with it. You will find a slightly updated modal.module CSS file, which you can use to replace yours. And checkout.js. I also attached this file because there I changed the returned JSX code slightly. For example, I wrapped the buttons in an extra div. So you can either replace your checkout.js file with mine, or at least replace your returned JSX code with mine. And once you did all of that, you should have a form that looks like this. Now, this is scrollable to make sure that we always are able to squeeze everything onto this screen. And of course, as always, you can tweak the styling and change this. This is just some basic styling which does the trick and looks okay, I would say. Now, with that, if we again start from scratch, we can add something to the cart, click on order, and then we get our form here. And actually, this should not be cut off. So I will change height to 19 rem here on the form. Slight oversight from my side, but with that, we're good. Now let's make sure we do get the values the user entered. We then validate them however we want. And we then also either show an error message if something's wrong with the entered data, or we submit it to a server. Now let's start with getting the entered data. For this, we got various options, 2 main options to be precise. We can either listen to every keystroke, get the entered data and store it in some state and update that state with every keystroke, or we get it once the overall form is submitted. Now in the forms section I showed you both, and I showed you various ways of handling user input and validating it. I showed all of that in great depth there. Therefore here I'll keep it simpler. I will not get the values with every keystroke. Instead I will use a reference with useRef to get the values only once the form is submitted. So I'll import useRef from React, and then we can create a reference by calling useRef, and we'll get a reference for our name input, for example. So a name input reference, which we get by calling useRef, like this. And I'll do this 4 times to repeat it for the street input, for the postal code input, and for the city input. And now we need to connect those refs to the form elements here. And for that, we can use the special ref prop, which we set on the input elements to connect this first input to the name input ref, the second input here to the street input ref, the third input here to the postal code input ref, and the last input here to the city input ref. Now these refs are connected, and now we can use them to read whatever the user entered when the form is submitted. Now for this we got our confirm handler here, and here we can then get the entered name by reaching out to the name input ref .current. It's always .current. That gives you access to the actual value stored in the ref, in this case to the input element. And since we now have access to an input element, we can access .value because every input element object in JavaScript has a value property that holds the actual value entered in that input element. And we also repeat this for the entered street, where we then use the street input ref to get the value, and we repeat it. Whoops, that should be entered street. We also repeat it for the entered postal code to use the postal code input ref. And one last time, we repeat it for the entered city to use the city input ref value. And now we can validate this. Now, it's of course up to you which validation logic you want to apply. I want to keep it fairly simple. I want to check that all my values are not empty and that the postal code, let's say, is exactly 5 digits long. For this, I'll add a couple of helper functions here outside of the component function. And the first one is the isEmpty helper function, where I get a value and return true if value is empty. For that, I call trim on value and then check if the length is equal to 0 or simply if the trimmed string is equal to an empty string. And the second helper function which I'll add here is the is not 5 chars, whatever you want to name it, where I get a value and I also trim this and I then check if the length is not equal to 5, so if it's not 5 characters long. Now these two helper functions can be used to now validate those entered values. So we can add a new constant, entered name is valid, and that should be true if we can call isEmpty and pass in the entered name, and that then returns false, so if it's not empty. So entered name is valid if not isEmpty entered name. If the entered name is not empty, this is valid. And I'll repeat this for the street. So the entered street is valid if not isEmpty entered street. And I'll repeat that for the city. So the entered city is valid if not isEmpty entered city. And now for the entered postal code to be valid, I will check if not is not 5 chars for the entered postal code. And that can be a bit confusing to read. Not is not. We could also simply name this is 5 chars up there and check for equality, like this. And then say it's valid if is 5 chars. That's the simpler form of writing this. We could do something similar for isEmpty and check for the opposite, but I think that's not too tricky to understand. Now we got these 4 helper variables here, which hold true or false. And now we can check if the overall form is valid by combining all these values. Only if all 4 constants here have a value of true, the overall form is valid. And I'm doing this very explicitly step by step here to make it as easy to follow along as possible. So now we can check if entered name is valid and entered street is valid. Combine that with entered city is valid. And last but not least, with entered postal code is valid. And only if all 4 together are true, form is valid will be true. So if form is valid, we can now submit the card data, because here we know that we gathered valid data and we cannot proceed with that. But if the form is not valid, we want to show an error. And therefore that's what I'll actually check for here. I'll check if not form is valid, and then I want to set an error and give some feedback to the user regarding what went wrong. For that, I will first of all return here to not continue with code execution, because later I will submit the card data here, and I don't want to reach that code if the form is invalid. But before we make it to this if check, I want to update some state to give the user some feedback. And here I want to manage 4 pieces of state since I have 4 inputs. And therefore, again, we could use reducer to kind of combine that all, or to manage that with a reducer function in general, but I will stick to use state here. You'll learn about use reducer and all of that in the forms module though. Now we'll use state, and I will register a new state here with use state. And here, whoops, not like this. Instead, some new state with use state. And here we could use 4 individual state slices or 1 combined state slice. And I'll go for the 1 combined state slice to mix things up. So here I have my form inputs validity and a function to set the form inputs validity. And now that will be an object where I have a name field, a street field, a city field, and a postal code field. And now we need to give those fields some values. And I simply want to have true or false as values here, determining whether the field is valid or not. And initially I'll treat them as valid even though they technically aren't, but I don't want to show error messages at the beginning. Now we could work with the touched state in addition to the validity state as we did it in the forms module, but to keep things a bit shorter here, and since we don't have an as elaborate validation approach as we did in the forms module, I will stick to a starting value of true here. Now the goal is to update the correct field for the different inputs here when we submitted the form, to update those true values with the actual validity after we tried to submit the form. So for this, maybe before we even derive form is valid, I will set the form inputs validity state to a new object. And here I want to set the name field to entered name is valid. The street field to entered street is valid, and so on. So I'll use those inferred validities, which we infer here as new values for the different keys in this state object. So here we have the entered postal code is valid value. Now we don't need the function form of this state updating function for updating here, because I am overriding the entire state with a brand new object where I do assign new values to all my keys. And with that we have information about the validity of the different fields. We can now utilize that in the JSX code down there, for example to show an error message. Here for the name, we could check if form inputs validity dot name, so if we dive into the name field, if that is not true, hence the exclamation mark, then we want to show a paragraph where we say please enter a valid name. Now if we do that and save this, you see initially that's empty, but if I try to confirm this, I now get this error. And of course we can now repeat that for all the inputs. So here we check .street and say please enter a valid street, and here we do it for the postal code, so .postal code, and then we say please enter a valid postal code, 5 characters long, and last but not least here we check for .city and say please enter a valid city. I also prepared some extra styles in the checkout module CSS file where I have an invalid class which we can add to these divs here if an input is invalid to show extra error styles. So here on the name input, for example, instead of just adding the control class, I'll set up a template literal here to always inject the control class into the string, but to also inject another class if that input should be invalid. So here we can check if form inputs validity.name. If that is true, I don't want to add any extra string to that classes string, but if it's false, I want to add classes.invalid here. With that, we add the extra invalid class to that list of classes if that input is not valid. And of course, instead of doing that inline here, we could also grab that code and add a new constant, name control classes, and store that value in that constant so that down there we just point at name control classes like this. That's an alternative way of doing that. And we can now also repeat that for the street by checking for form inputs validity.street. And we do that for the other inputs as well. And we have some code duplication here, but again, that's also something we talked about in the forms module. And we could, for example, reduce that by creating a separate input component, or reduce some other duplication by adding a custom forms hook, for example. For the moment here, I'll stick to this approach. And hence I'll add a postal code control classes constant where I check form inputs validity.postal code, and then add another constant, the city control classes, where we check form inputs validity.city. And now we just need to assign these constants to the different divs. So here for the street div, it's the street control classes constant, which we assign as a value for class name. Here for the postal code, it's the postal code control classes, which we assign as a value to class name. And for the city, it's the city control classes. And with those changes made, if we save this, if I confirm this, we get a bunch of error styles. And of course, if I enter something valid and I confirm this, it's not showing up for that input again. So you see that this now works. Now feel free to definitely turn this into a more elaborate form validation here. For example, by adding a custom form hook, or by also listening to the touch state and clearing errors as you start typing. We did dive into all of that in the form section. I just didn't want to bloat this module again with all the topics covered there. Instead, the goal was to pull out the essence of that module and just add some basic form validation here. And therefore, with all of that, we can now also confirm this without errors if we enter valid values. And hence now, as a last step, let's make sure that those values are fetched and are sent to the backend. So let's now send a request once the form is submitted. Now this checkout component is already a pretty full component with a lot of code in there, and therefore I'll not add the request logic in there, but instead I want to kind of submit or send the submitted data back to the cart, where we then also have the cart data, which is good because we need that to send it to the server, to then send both the cart data, so the items in the cart, as well as the submitted user data to the server. Now, one important word here. On a server, you should typically never trust the data you get from a client, because validation as we built it here can always be circumvented. For example, I, as a visitor, could edit the loaded JavaScript code. It's not hidden from me, I can edit it. Attached you find an article and a video with more information on that. Therefore, you typically always want to validate incoming data on the server as well. Now here, we only have a dummy backend with Firebase, and whilst we could actually also add some server-side logic to that, that's simply not the focus of this course, since this course is about React, which is a client-side library. If you want to dive into server-side code, server-side validation, writing your own server-side code, I of course also got courses on this, for example my Node.js course. But that's just a side note. I just wanted to emphasize that you should not trust client-side data like this. You, for example, typically also would want to validate those submitted cart item prices with actual database data on the server. It's not something we do here, but I want to make you aware of that. So therefore, it's the cart component where that data should be submitted to the server. And for this, I'll add a new function in that cart component. Submit order handler, that could be the name of that function. And in here, I expect to get the user data as an argument, as a parameter. We already get access to the cart data through the cart context, so that won't be a problem. And therefore, all we now gotta do is make sure that this submit order function is called from inside the checkout component and that it receives that user data. So for that, I'll pass it to the checkout component through a prop. Let's say the on submit or on confirm prop, up to you, it's your component, where I point at the submit order handler. So on confirm is the prop name, hence in checkout, in this confirm handler. Once we validated everything down here, we now want to call props.onConfirm. So that prop name we're expecting here in the cart component. We want to call props on confirm and now forward that user data, which should be an object because I'm not expecting multiple arguments for the name, street, city, and so on, but I am expecting just one argument here, the collected user data. So let's group that user data into an object here where we set the name equal to the entered name, not the validity, but just the name. Set a street field to the entered street, set the city field to the entered city, and set the postal code to the entered postal code like this. And with that, we pass the data from the checkout component to the cart component. In there, we now want to send the request to the backend, and we want to send both the user data as well as the cart data. Now for this, we can again use the fetch function and send a request to Firebase. So to our Firebase URL here, and then to a new node of our choice, for example, orders.json. You don't need to create it in advance. It will be created dynamically. And the important thing now is that this should be a post request. So we need to pass this configuration object as a second argument to fetch and set method to post. We then also need to add the body and set this to JSON stringify, since we need to send JSON data, and pass in all our data. And that's an object with the user data. So here we could set a user field and pass the user data we're getting here as a value for that field. And then maybe add a ordered items field. And that should then be our cart. Now for this, we have our cart context where we get our items. So we can then set cart context items as a value for the ordered items. And that's the data we're then sending to the backend. Now, just like this, without anything else, it should already work. We're not handling the response yet, we're not handling errors or anything like that, but we are sending a post request. So this should already work. If we save that, and I do have some data entered here, I do have some cart data, and I click confirm, that should have worked. And indeed, if we check the Firebase console, you should see an orders node now with a new auto-generated ID for this newly added item. And then in there we have user with the user data we entered and ordered items with the cart data we submitted. So that is working. If it's not working, definitely double check your code, compare it to mine, because that should now be working. Now, therefore, as a last step, I of course want to change the user experience a little bit. I want to clear what we see on the screen here if we clicked confirm and show a loading spinner and then a success message if the card was submitted. And of course, the card should then also be cleared thereafter. So let's handle this submission state. And for this, we need use state and then manage a new piece of state here in the card component. And that is the is submitting state and set is submitting. And initially that's false. But I want to set it to true as soon as the submit order handler gets called. So here I'll set is submitting to true. Then I want to wait for this fetch function to finish. And for this, we can await this and turn this into an async function. Here we have no problem with that because this is not an effect function, but instead this is a regular function which gets triggered when we submit the form. So here we then await and we get back our response, and we could now use the response to check the status code and potentially throw an error, which we then would have to handle to also show an error message. I will not do that here to keep this a bit shorter, and instead I'll assume that it always works. In reality, of course, and maybe as an extra practice, you might want to implement error handling as well, just as we did it a couple of minutes ago with the other fetch request for loading the meals or in the HTTP module. Here, to save some time, I will not implement it. Instead, we submit this, or we set is submitting, then we await this, and therefore once this request is done and we got a response, we can set is submitting back to false. But now I want to make sure that we show some success message. And therefore I'll add another state, the did submit state, and set did submit. And initially that's also false, but this should be set to true as soon as we did submit our data. So here we can then set did submit to true once we're done sending that request. And now we can work with these two states in our component. To be precise, I want to swap the entire content of the modal when we're submitting and once we did submit. So I'll add a new constant which I'll name cart modal content. And in there, I'll store all that code here. Now, since I now have multiple sibling items here inside of that constant, I need to wrap that with react.fragment. So we want to wrap this because, as you learned, sibling JSX code is not allowed. And for this, of course, we need to import React from React. With that, we can wrap that all with a fragment, and now we got the cart modal content which I normally want to render here, like this. But I'll now define another constant, the is submitting modal content, and that's the content that should be shown if we are currently submitting. And here I'll just add a paragraph where I say sending order data. Now that should be shown if we are submitting. Therefore, I only want to show the cart modal content if we're not submitting, hence the exclamation mark. If we are submitting, I want to show the is submitting modal content. Now last but not least, we can of course also be done with submitting. So I'll add another constant, did submit modal content, and that's another paragraph where I say successfully sent the order. And we could, of course, then also say something like, you will be contacted once we're done preparing your order or anything like that. Here I'll just say successfully sent the order, and that should be showing up if we did submit. Then the did submit modal content should be rendered. And therefore we should also tweak these two lines and only show the cart modal content if we're not submitting, and we did not submit yet. Did submit like this. So if not submitting and not did submit, then show the cart modal content. I always want to show the is submitting modal content if we are submitting. But otherwise, if we did submit, I want to show the did submit modal content, maybe if we are not currently submitting. Though in this app, we can't really be submitting and have submitted already. Nonetheless, having this extra check also won't hurt. I hope this logic is clear. With that in place, if we now save this, we got our cart here. If I click order, I now need to fill in my data, otherwise I get errors. So let's enter something here. And if I now click confirm, watch closely, we see our two other states. Is submitting, and now the successfully sent the order state. And of course, we can now still close the modal by clicking somewhere else. We can, of course, also add a new button to the modal here if we want to. We can wrap this here into a fragment as well, so that we can have two sibling components, the paragraph, and then next to that, for example, a button. So here we could grab our modal actions div, and insert this next to this paragraph, get rid of that order button and just keep the close button, and give this a class of button instead of button alt. And on click, this will then close the modal. So if we now save this, if I again order this, enter some data here. Whoops, max and test street 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and test. Now I can close this with this button. So now we're showing these different states. Now, as a last step, I want to clear the cart once we did submit, because currently it's never cleared. Our items stay in the cart. So to clear that cart, we need to go to our cart context, to the cart provider to be precise, and there we'll need a new action. We do have actions for adding and removing single items, but now we need an action to clear the entire cart. So I'll add a new if check in this reducer here, which we added here in this cart reducer, and check for action.type being equal to clear. And if we do receive this kind of action, then I want to return a new state where the cart is empty. Now for this, we can return the default cart state simply, like this. And of course, therefore, technically, we could also omit this if check. If we do dispatch an action which is not handled by one of our other if checks, we would have returned the default cart state anyways, but doing it like this is a bit more explicit. Now we need to make sure that this clear action can be dispatched, and for this we want to add a new function here, the clear cart handler, where we don't expect any parameters but dispatch a new cart action where the type is set to clear, like this. And now on the context, we need a new function. So in cart context.js, I'll prepare it so that we get better auto-completion, the clear cart function. And in cart provider, on this concrete cart context object, which we're constructing, we now need to add this clear cart function and point at the clear cart handler, like this. And now from inside the cart component, we can execute that. So here in cart.js, when we submit our order in the submit order handler, once we're done here at the end, I want to use my cart context and call clear cart to clear the cart once we're done submitting. So if we now save this one more time and go back, now if I order here and enter something, if I confirm this, now my cart was cleared and it is empty. And of course on Firebase, on our backend, we see all those orders. Now that is it for this module. Now we're leveraging a backend for fetching our meals and for sending our orders there. We did add a form with validation, which we have to fill out, and we therefore practiced the key concepts and aspects we learned about over the last course sections. Now, of course, there's a lot which you could fine-tune or change. As I mentioned, you can implement more elaborate form validation. You can definitely add more complexity to this project. But my goal with this project here was to dive into the essence of those previous sections so that we practice the core concepts taught in those sections. Again, I can only encourage you to dive deeper, build some custom hooks, experiment with this project, maybe build your own project as well. That's always a great practice to ensure that you get better and better with React. In this course, however, we got so much content and I don't want to waste your time. Therefore, I'll try to find the right balance between diving deep when I introduce a concept and then practicing the core takeaways and the core concepts in practical projects like this. And therefore, let's now move on and let's dive deeper into React.